欢迎来到我们的突发事件节目。今天我们有一些引人注目的新闻要和大家分享。首先，加拿大军方被告知，如果政府愿意拥抱商业选项，那么加拿大可以比计划中提前10年在北极获得现代化的卫星覆盖。接着，对于那些寻求抗衰老解决方案的人来说，有好消息，一款受欢迎的瑞蒂诺纯霜正在亚马逊上大减价，仅售$19。最后，我们将探讨一个争议性的话题，一家中国公司出售了其在澳洲昆士兰海岸外一个热带岛屿的租约，这引起了居民和政府的关注。请大家继续收看详细内容。首先，继续关注习近平在5月6日的巴黎行程。5月6号是中国国家主席习近平第3次对法国国事访问的第一天，下午举行法中双边会谈后，在爱丽舍宫向新闻界发表联合声明，但没有授权记者提问。随后，习近平在法国巴黎马里尼剧院同马克龙总统共同出席中法企业家委员会第6次会议闭幕式并致辞。习近平强调，中方愿继续积极利用从法国农场到中国餐桌权链条快速协同机制，让奶酪、火腿、葡萄酒等更多法国优质农产品出现在中国老百姓的餐桌上。中方决定将对法国等12国公民短期来华的免签政策延长至2025年年底。在习近平上台讲话前，画面显示他的贴身随行帮他把一杯水从茶几端到了讲台上。此外，爱丽舍宫发出了一份受邀参加今晚国宴的名单，其中不乏一些有趣的名字。女演员萨尔玛·海耶克和这个杀手不太冷的导演吕克·贝松将出席文化界的晚宴。来自商业界的有世界首富 LMVH 公司的伯纳德·阿诺特以及轩尼诗干邑的首席执行官洛朗·布瓦洛。来自 Stellantis、Airbus、Alstom、Air France、BNP Paribas 等公司的其他商界领袖也在其中。稍早，根据公布的中法经济会议嘉宾名单，包括华为、中兴、中车、商汤科技、天合光能、金科能源、小鹏汽车、上汽集团、中远集团等在内的众多中国企业，看起来似乎是被美国制裁的中国企业，这一次都来法国了。让米歇尔·贾尔也在其中，他去年4月也去了北京。在当今这个快速变化的世界里，从加拿大军事的太空监视技术，到日常生活中的抗衰老护肤品，再到金融市场上的股票投资，创新和灵活的思维方式正在引领着各个领域的发展。让我们一起来探索这些领域的最新动态，看看专家们是如何建议我们应对这些挑战的。首先，我们来看看加拿大的太空监视技术。根据 CBC 的报道 ，MDA Canada 的 CEO Mike Greenlee 在众议院委员会上发言，指出加拿大在军事太空能力方面正在落后于其他国家，并未有效地与航太公司合作。他强调，如果政府愿意采用商业选项，加拿大可以比计划提前10年获得现代化的北极卫星覆盖。目前，加拿大的 RadarSat 星座卫星系统已经老化，可能在2026年达到使用寿命的终点，但它们的替代品要到2035年以后才会发射。Greenlee 敦促加拿大效仿美国和英国，从私营部门采购太空能力。在生活消费品方面 ，Yahoo US 报道了一款受欢迎的抗衰老式黄唇面霜，其价格从$25降至$19。Nature Well Clinical Retinol Advanced Moisture Cream 还有微胶囊化式黄唇，旨在更新、滋润和紧致皮肤。该产品已经收到了超过9000个5星评价，顾客们表示它能紧致皱纹皮肤，改善肤质和肤色。此外，这款产品无残忍，不含对羟基苯甲酸酯，无染料，无麸质，唯一的批评是泵式容器可能不易使用。最后，让我们转向金融市场。根据 Telegraph 的报道 ，Quaestor 分析了标准银行的股票，认为这家专注于新兴市场的银行的股票价格便宜，并应能支付健康的股息。尽管亚洲经济的挣扎、强势美元以及贷款簿上损失的风险等因素对银行的股票构成了3重压力，但银行的第一季度业绩表明其表现良好。标准银行的估值仅为每股有形净资产价值的 0.67 倍 13.90 美元，这为股票提供了一定的下行保护和上行潜力。这3个案例展示了在不同领域中专家们如何建议我们应对挑战。无论是在国家安全、个人护理还是金融投资方面，创新的思维和灵活的策略都是关键。通过对这些领域的深入了解，我们可以更好地把握未来的机会，应对未来的挑战。 在一个世界充满变化和挑战的时代，文化、政治和自然环境的故事交织在一起，展现出人类社会的丰富多样性和复杂性。从纽约的时尚展览到澳大利亚的热带岛屿，再到美国的政治舞台，每一个故事都揭示了当下社会的一个面向。首先 ，The Globe and Mail 带来了一则关于纽约大都会艺术博物馆的时尚展览，睡美人：时尚的觉醒 （Sleeping Beauties: Reawakening Fashion） 的报道。这场展览以其220件博物馆自藏的时尚藏品为特色，其中16件脆弱的服装因过于珍贵而被储存在展示柜中。展览不仅展示了模糊花卉风格的礼服、迷你版的 Christian Dior 的 Miss Dior 裙子和Yves Saint Laurent 精致刺绣的夹克，还采用了多感官的方式，包括透过塑料管让访客闻到香味，以及在无回声室内聆听布料声音的体验。这场展览将于周五向公众开放，持续至9月2日，为时尚爱好者带来一场视觉和感官的盛宴。接着 ，Australian Broadcasting Corporation 报道了一则关于中国公司 Aces Forest Ltd 出售其在澳大利亚昆士兰海岸的热带岛屿凯斯威克岛 （Keswick Island） 租赁权的新闻。自2019年以来，该公司与岛上居民之间的紧张关系日益升级，居民们期望新的业主能够投入数亿美元来改善这个多年来一直被忽视的岛屿。目前，转让租赁的申请已经提交给昆士兰资源部，新承租人的财务管理评估正在进行中。最后 ，The Independent 报道了演员凯文·史派西 （Kevin Spacey） 对独立总统候选人罗伯特 ·F. 肯尼迪 （Robert F. Kennedy Jr.） 的支持。肯尼迪是一位声名狼藉的阴谋论者和疫苗怀疑论者，他在2024年的总统竞选中将面对共和党提名人唐纳德·特朗普 （Donald Trump） 和民主党提名人乔·拜登 （Joe Biden）。史派西的支持来自于对肯尼迪作为忠实朋友的认可，尽管他自己因被指控性骚扰而受到舆论的关注。这3则故事从不同角度展现了当今世界的多面性。无论是时尚界的创新展览，还是环境与社区管理的争议，亦或是政治领域的争议与支持，每一个故事都是时代脉搏的一部分，反映了人类社会的多样性和复杂性。通过这些故事，我们可以看到人们如何在变化中寻找平衡，如何在挑战中寻求创新和进步。在最近的一系列事件中，美国副总统卡马拉·哈里斯在密歇根州的行程被以色列总理内塔尼亚胡的政策所影响，而伊万卡·特朗普出席迈阿密海滩晚宴的时尚选择，以及纽约警察局对校园抗议活动的反应，都成为了媒体关注的焦点。这些事件虽然看似不相干，但都反映了当前美国社会的一些深层次问题和分歧。据《独立报》报道，哈里斯副总统最近访问了密歇根州底特律，试图聚焦于经济问题，并争取该州的支持。密歇根州在2016年投票给了唐纳德·特朗普，在2020年则支持了乔·拜登。该州拥有大量的黑人工人阶级人口，这个关键的选民群体近年来对民主党越来越失望。拜登和哈里斯必须让选民相信，尽管存在高物价和联邦储备决定保持高利率以抑制通胀的担忧，美国经济正在复苏。然而，以色列和哈马斯之间持续的冲突也给拜登政府带来了挑战，因为许多密歇根州的阿拉伯裔美国人认为，拜登对以色列的支持是一种背叛，并批评他对加沙局势的处理。另一方面，雅虎美国报道了伊万卡·特朗普在卡本海滩晚宴红毯上的时尚选择。伊万卡身着一双裸色的克里斯汀·鲁布托 （Christian Louboutin） 罗莎莉 （Rosalie） 系带凉鞋，与丈夫贾里德·库什纳一同出现在迈阿密海滩的临时餐厅。她之前还穿着一对金属银色的木屐。伊万卡的这一时尚选择虽然看似与政治无关，却在一定程度上反映了特朗普家族在政治场外的生活方式与品味。同时，华盛顿邮报探讨了近期校园内针对以色列在加沙战争处理方式的抗议活动。文章指出，纽约警察局将校园抗议活动归咎于非学生是一种误解，认为年轻人被各种行为或技术洗脑的长期信念是不成立的。实际上，年轻人以及许多美国人对战争的进行方式表示反对，抗议活动是表达这些反对意见的一种方式。文章批评了纽约警察局对哥伦比亚大学抗议活动的反应，指出警方将链条和书籍作为外部煽动者激进化学生的证据，而这些物品实际上是由大学出售的，其中一本书甚至只是关于恐怖行动的教科书。 文章强调，抗议活动并非完全或唯一由接受资助的组织驱动，也没有理由认为需要大量资金才能存在这些抗议。最简单的解释是，年轻人比老一辈更同情巴勒斯坦的立场，这并不是一个新现象。这3篇报道从不同角度展示了美国社会当前面临的挑战和分歧。无论是政治领袖的外交政策、名人的生活方式选择，还是年轻一代的社会抗议活动，都在以不同的方式影响着美国的社会结构和政治风景。这些事件虽然各自独立，但共同构成了美国社会复杂多面的现实图景。在全球范围内，文化输出和地缘政治的交织愈加明显，这不仅反映在媒体和娱乐产业的争议之中，也体现在各国对于外部干预的应对措施，以及经济领域对于外部压力的敏感反应上。从 Netflix 投资中国科幻系列《三体》问题的风波，到加拿大准备立法对抗外国干预，再到老挝等亚太地区国家面临的债务压力，这些事件揭示了当今世界复杂多变的面貌。澳大利亚广播公司 Australian Broadcasting Corporation 报道了 Netflix 改编中国畅销科幻系列《三体》问题所引发的争议。该系列对中国文化大革命的描绘，在中国观众中引起了激烈的辩论。一方面有人认为 Netflix 忠于原著，另一方面则有人指责该流媒体服务平台诽谤中国。这场辩论最终触动了中国的审查制度，导致该国最著名的影评网站暂停了对该系列的评论功能。三体问题的改编之路充满挑战，包括一起谋杀案和被指责削弱了故事的中国根源。然而，中国科幻在国际上的关注度逐渐提高，这一类型的普遍吸引力被视为中国科幻系列吸引好莱坞巨额投资的原因之一。加拿大环球邮报 The Globe and Mail 报道了加拿大准备立法对抗外国干预的动向。这项立法是在环球邮报和其他媒体对中国外国干预活动和虚假信息的报道数月后提出的。该报道基于机密文件和国家安全员。该法案关于对抗外国干预的法案预计将于当天在众议院提出。这项立法跟随着一个持续的外国干预调查的启示而来。日经亚洲 Nikkei Asia 则关注了老挝和其他亚太地区债务负担国家面临的压力。这些国家对美元的货币弱势引发了对陷入债务危机的担忧。亚洲新兴和中等收入国家的公共债务预计将在2024年增长至其联合 GDP 的 82.4%， 远高于欧洲和拉丁美洲的类似国家。老挝的公共债务超过 GDP 的 120%， 其中一半的外债欠于中国。帕劳和斐济的债务水平也超过了 GDP 的 80%。这些国家由于面临海平面上升和极端天气的脆弱性，需要在基础设施发展上进行财政支出。这些报道共同揭示了当前国际环境中的一系列挑战和机遇。无论是在文化输出还是经济发展方面，国家之间的互动总是在复杂的地缘政治背景下进行。从三体问题引发的争议，到对抗外国干预的立法，再到亚太地区国家面临的债务压力，这些事件都凸显了在全球化背景下管理国家关系和保护国家利益的复杂性。在最近的一系列新闻中，各大媒体报道了从体育到国际政治的多元议题，展现了世界各地正在发生的重要事件。首先，来自 Yahoo US 的报道，密西根州立大学足球队迎来了来自内布拉斯加的转学生 Arjuan Beckley。这位防守战将在过去3年中为玉米穗者队出战9场比赛后，决定转投密西根州立，带着剩余的2年资格加盟。拥有6英尺5英寸、300磅体重的 Beckley 将为斯巴达队的防线增添重要的力量。在2021年初次承诺加入内布拉斯加时， Beckley 肯定没有想到自己的未来会在密西根州立大学继续。而在国际政治方面， The Globe and Mail 报道了一个严峻的现实。联合国表示，经过与哈马斯之间近7个月的战争后，北加萨地区已陷入全面饥荒。这场战争导致近1/3的加萨人口经历了最高级别的灾难性饥饿。尽管在战争的破坏下，确认死亡率变得极其困难，但北加萨已达到了正式宣布饥荒的3个标准之一，第2个标准也几乎达到。这一严重的人道主义危机凸显了对加萨230万人民的援助需求，呼吁更多援助得以进入该地区。另一方面，来自 The Sydney Morning Herald 的报道则关注了美国前总统唐纳德·特朗普的政治立场。特朗普对于第2任期的优先事项似乎更加关注国内的敌人，而非外部对手。 他在一次采访中3次提到了内部敌人，这种措辞让人联想到约瑟夫·麦卡锡时代的共产主义猎巫。然而，特朗普所指的内部敌人似乎是那些在民主政治框架内与他持不同政见的人。特朗普甚至暗示，为了打击政治对手，他愿意使用违宪或非法的手段。这种对国内敌人的定义和对待方式，显示了特朗普对民主价值的轻视，以及他对权力的渴望。这些报道从不同的角度展示了世界的多面性，从体育的转会到国际的人道危机，再到政治领袖的争议性言论。每一篇报道都是一个独立的故事，但它们共同构成了当今世界错综复杂的图景。这些故事提醒我们，无论是在体育场上的竞争，还是在国际舞台上的冲突，或是政治领域内的争论，每一个决定和行动都会对人们的生活产生深远的影响。谢谢您的收看。上面播报的内容是六度团队推荐的全球专业媒体、智库、政府机构和行业专家的最新报道、分析简报。更详细的内容，请大家去这些媒体、智库的网站阅读。这些内容并不一定反映六度简报的立场，亦不能作为任何决策的建议。六度团队由专业媒体人、学者、科学家组成的独立新型媒体，大家可以根据自己的专业要求订阅各种简报。网址是6dobrief.com， 您在世界任何地方都可以通过电邮收到六度简报。
China's foreign and security policymaking apparatus is often described as a metaphorical black box about which analysts know little. This is true to an extent, but at the same time, it's possible to develop a better understanding of the people, institutions, processes, and pressures that go into making China's policy toward the world during Xi's new era, that is, his time as the country's top leader. This report pursues that objective by identifying 5 major trends, mostly internal to the PRC party-state system, that shape its foreign and security policy decision-making. The paper then describes the effects that each trend generates, from bureaucratic incentives to behavioral patterns. I'll go through each trend briefly. The paper goes into great detail laying out the evidence underpinning each trend, so I'll just focus my presentation on the effects that each trend creates. So the first trend is personalization of the system around Xi Jinping. The paper argues that this reduces the influence of various interest groups and therefore the need to bargain with and among them. It raises the prospect of groupthink amongst the loyalists Xi has surrounded himself with, and also potentially increases the importance of achieving certain goals for China under Xi's watch. In addition, this trend creates Xi's centrality, creates a major management bottleneck that could hamper the system during even brief absences. The second major trend is empowering the Chinese Communist Party over the Chinese state. This trend has made more officials into policy implementers rather than policy makers, even on issues below the level of strategy. It's also increased central demands for ideological study, such as Xi Jinping thought study sessions. At the same time, while China's leadership wants to improve coordination and might be making some progress through organizations like the Central Foreign Affairs Commission, it stops short of actions that could allow government organs to really coordinate horizontally, if doing so might plausibly jeopardize the center's control and Xi Jinping's control. The third trend is domestic policy headwinds, including economic slowdown and the search for alternative forms of political legitimacy for the Chinese Communist Party. This creates 2 contradictory pressures. On the one hand, China reaching out and trying to improve ties with the world to attract and retain capital and technology. And on the other hand, China's turn to an assertive and at times even aggressive form of nationalism to counteract stalling economic growth. These headwinds also dent the power and influence that China gained through its rapid rise and its role as a massive market driving global economic growth. The fourth major trend is elevation of regime security over other concerns, particularly economic development. The report argues that this trend negatively affects Beijing's ties with foreign countries by worsening the experience of foreigners visiting and living in China, by creating an export of China's repressive political ideas, techniques, and technologies to the world, and by complicating how China's foreign and security bureaucracy interacts with its counterparts, in part because they don't know who to invest in building relationships with amidst a changing leadership structure below Xi Jinping. The fifth and final trend is diplomatic and military assertiveness and seeking an active global leadership role. The report argues that this feeds a self-reinforcing cycle of growing tensions, that it requires PRC diplomats to shoehorn any activities into Xi Jinping's marquee frameworks, from the Belt and Road Initiative to the global security initiatives, and also leads China to build out structures of an alternative international order. This includes a growing list of strategic partnerships, most prominently with Russia, China-led or dominated international organizations such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and also China's more active approach to mediation in conflicts around the world, despite its mixed track record. So that's the trends. Examining these trends can help illuminate those macro pressures shaping China's foreign and security policy decision-making. Still, admittedly, many aspects of how the party state makes decisions remain opaque. In the paper, I call these known unknowns, to borrow a phrase from former U.S. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, and I argue that it's helpful to be explicit about what these areas are. Where are our knowledge gaps? These include information flows to senior leaders and what in the U.S. context would be called the paper process. It includes the dynamic among Xi and his top advisors and exactly how that works. And it also includes the structure and frequency of important meetings and who participates in those, how they're staffed, etc. And I also argue that more information about those areas might shed light on larger knowledge gaps related to whether there are informal constraints on Xi Jinping's power, and if so, by what mechanisms they operate, and also how Xi Jinping is thinking about the eventual transfer of power, however far out into the future. Finally, the report argues that to better understand and respond to the intricacies of China's foreign and security policy decision-making, the United States and like-minded partners should take action across 7 areas. The first is to recognize that Xi's personal style and preferences are now the dominant factor shaping China's foreign and security policies, but how that reality manifests will continue to evolve. So we're about 11 and a half years into Xi Jinping's reign as China's top leader, and the situation has changed as Xi Jinping is reaching new heights of power, as his signature policies have had time to take effect for good. Sometimes they work and sometimes not. And as China's overall power trajectory is beginning to level off, if not decline. So the China of Xi's third term will be different than earlier periods. So that's number one. Number two, policymakers should track how trends shaping China's decision-making might affect the country's various bureaucratic institutions differently. So for example, we're seeing sort of an empowerment of the Ministry of State Security, China's foreign intelligence organization, while we're seeing a People's Liberation Army that on the one hand is getting more resources and relevance, but on the other hand, it's also getting much more scrutiny from the top leadership. Recommendation number 3, that leaders should anticipate uncoordinated Chinese actions, such as the 2023 spy balloon incident, as well as policies characterized by drift, followed by rapid shifts. And they should do so because they reflect structural features of the system. At the end of the day, coordination still has important limits. And so you see some lack of coordination. And in addition, you see that the incentives at the implementer level are often either to over-implement top-level guidance or to sort of do nothing to avoid getting blamed. And so hence you see shifts like we saw with the end of the zero COVID policy. Recommendation 4, call for policymakers to prepare for deepening policy contradictions alongside continued assertive nationalism from Beijing. Here, we see that Xi Jinping ostensibly provides what he calls top-level design for Chinese foreign policy, which should mean more coherent policy formulation. But in practice, that's often meant that the Chinese state and the party state often isn't hashing out policy trade-offs in a robust interagency process, and are therefore ending up with sometimes contradictory policies that are driven by more by slogans than by a detailed reckoning with the on-the-ground implementation realities. Recommendation number 5 is for U.S. policymakers to prioritize direct diplomatic interactions with Xi Jinping. And there's a couple of rationales here, but the main one is that there's no other way to be sure we can inject information, including key signaling, but also clearing up misperceptions into Xi Jinping's information bubble. And as he has more power in the system, but surrounds himself more with loyalists, we're likely to see that information bubble become more constricting. Six, I argue that U.S. policymakers should formally compare assessments of the PRC system with allies and partners. So here we recognize that China's foreign and security policy is going to function in one way towards the United States as a major power rival and competitor, and is probably another way towards every state in the international system. So everyone sort of has a piece of this puzzle, and we should do more to put them together to understand how the machine works overall. Seventh, and finally, we call for developing contingency plans for different leadership succession scenarios. Here, call on the old aphorism from Dwight Eisenhower that plans are worthless, but planning is everything. And the idea is really to think through challenges that would come with Xi Jinping's leadership succession, however it happens, to think through those challenges in advance so we're not grappling with them for the first time as events unfold. So with that, that's the report in a nutshell. Readers will find much more detail in the complete version, which is available to download for free on cnas.org. Now we'll move to the panel portion of the event. Before I introduce our speakers, I just want to remind everyone to put your questions in the chat on cnas.org/live or use the hashtag CNAS2024 to submit them, and we'll look forward to taking those questions later in the discussion. We're lucky to have with us a top flight group of experts to discuss these issues today. I'll introduce each of them briefly, and then we'll jump into a discussion. First, we have Rory Daniels. Rory is the managing director of the Asia Society Policy Institute, where she leads and oversees strategy and operation for ASPI's projects on security, climate change, and trade throughout Asia. She's also a senior fellow with ASPI's Center for China Analysis. She was previously with the National Committee on American Foreign Policy, where she managed the organization's Track 2 and research portfolio on Asian security issues, with a particular focus on cross-Taiwan Strait relations, U.S.-China relations, and the North Korean nuclear program. Her most recent research project audited the U.S.-China strategic and economic dialogue to evaluate its process and outcomes. So welcome, Rory. Next, we have Amanda Shao. Amanda is a senior analyst for China at the International Crisis Group. She focuses on conflicts in which China plays an important role and developments in China's foreign policy that relate to conflict prevention and resolution. Prior to the Crisis Group, Amanda established and managed the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue's China program in Beijing, overseeing projects related to the South China Sea, U.S.-China relations, and China's evolving approach to conflict mediation. Before that, Amanda was a field researcher on the conflicts in Sudan and South Sudan for the Enough Project. Welcome, Amanda. And last but not least, we have Jude Blanchette, who holds the Freeman Chair in China Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Previously, he was engagement director at the Conference Board's China Center for Economics and Business in Beijing, where he researched China's political environment with a focus on the workings of the Chinese Communist Party and its impact on foreign companies and investors. Prior to working at the Conference Board, Jude was the assistant director of the 21st Century China Center at the University of California, San Diego. And his book is China's New Red Guards, The Return of Radicalism and the Rebirth of Mao Zedong, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2019. Welcome, Jude. So I want to start off this panel with a fairly broad question. So as you talked about a little bit in discussing the report, we've seen China's foreign and security policy evolve over the 11 and a half years under Xi Jinping. Broadly speaking, what do you all see as areas of continuity? And where do you see as important continuity? And where do you see as areas of important change? Rory, perhaps I can go to you first.
Okay, thank you, Jake. And thanks so much for having me on this panel. I really enjoyed reading the report. I think if you haven't read it yet, you really should give yourself some time to sit down and digest it. I think it's a really interesting and useful summary of analysis that gives us a starting place to talk about, have a very nuanced conversation about what's going on in China and how to approach it. So in terms of continuity and change in the Xi area, I really think the areas of change that I see most dramatic are access and influence in the policymaking decision chain. As decision making tightens around Xi Jinping and a few of the people who are closest to his inner circle, access and influence has waned and changed for other actors in the Chinese system. And this difference of access and influence makes it harder to kind of assess how to approach China in the Xi era, because it is constantly changing and it's pretty opaque. And it's created a bit of a feedback loop with Xi Jinping and the parties, the top party leadership's expectation for how China should use its power in the world and how that power should be perceived. I think that, there's a sense among those top leaders that a bigger, stronger China should be able to exert its power in the Indo-Pacific and the developing world. And there's also a sense that keeping China strong requires big systemic changes. So the biggest area of continuity I see is that those systemic changes are very, very difficult to enact and make sticky. Whether it's moving up the economic value chain, so encouraging people to, have more household consumption and less savings to move into the capital market, to diversify industry, to grow the private sector. That's been a huge area of continuity for China that its leadership would like to change. Reform of the international system as well, the ability for China to exert influence in the international system and to shape standards favorable to its interests is another area where China's leadership really wants to see more systemic change. And then finally, I think rooting out corruption is a big part of this. And, the corruption campaign, which I think is a major area of change in the Xi Jinping era, has to some extent been enacted in order to manage real problems with corruption in Chinese society and in the Chinese domestic political economy. But it's also been used at times to shape that political environment, to shape that access and influence environment. So what has mostly changed is the style of leadership. The kind of underlying problems and priorities, I think, are pretty continuous. And the problem is that it's really not working for Xi Jinping. He's not been able to, at least in the short term, use this change in style to affect those bigger, larger systematic changes. And there's pushback everywhere. I mean, there's pushback among U.S. allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific to some of China's expanding national territorial interests, maritime territorial interests. There's pushback inside the system as officials want to kind of continue doing things the way they've always been done, as local governments continue to hold debt, and a lot of bad debt, as the property sector continues to be a place for household savings. And even as young people decide to opt out of the system in their own ways by lying flat or not having babies, even though the Chinese government has encouraged full employment and a more robust, population demographic system. So the net effect of all of this is a China that's got an extremely tight political environment, a sense of dissatisfaction at the top, and therefore a bit of path dependence towards tightening control of the system in order to make these big systemic changes. And the long-term question and challenge is, will it work? Will over the long term, will this change in leadership style endure in ways that actually help China reach its systemic changes and goals?
Thank you, Roy. There's so much there. There's a really comprehensive answer. Amanda, I wonder if I could turn to you for your take on this question of continuity versus change.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jake. And just to echo what Rory said, your report really addresses, I think, some of the most important questions that this community should be asking. And I think part of the beauty of this sort of research is it unearths a lot of the other questions that we just simply don't have answers to right now. So congratulations on that. I approach this question slightly differently. I agree a lot with what Rory said. But in terms of continuity, I think we've seen more continuity than change in Xi Jinping's approach, at least at the strategic level. You know, when we look at a number of key elements in terms of, China's strategic objectives or their assessment of the external environment, there's a lot of continuity there. So whether that is this consistent linkage between, China's pursuit of national rejuvenation and the way it links with a more amenable external environment, right? That is a constant trend. This assessment of the long-term trajectory of the world, this view that the world is essentially in a period of transition, right? Moving from a unipolarity with the US at the top towards multipolarity, what the CCP likes to call the basic trend, which is in large part, driven by China's accruing power and declining US power. And this idea that how China plays its cards during this transitional period will really determine, right, how quickly it reaches rejuvenation, or even whether it can reach rejuvenation. I mean, that's a through line, I think, in these sort of 11 years, right? And another one would be just a very hostile and skeptical assessment of US and Western intentions, which, leads to this idea that China is in a long-term struggle, with the West, which then leads to this, I would say, a particular hallmark of Xi's foreign policy, which you lay out in the report, which is the idea that China has to be more proactive in the defense of its sovereignty and its territorial integrity. And the idea really that regardless of how cooperative China seeks to be with its neighbors and with its major powers, that this cannot come at the expense of the defense of its core interests, right? And so we've seen here increasing uses of coercion and force under Xi Jinping. I think where we see the most change, I would call those maybe tactical shifts rather than shifts in overall strategy or ideology. Of course, there's been a bit of a shift in the assessment of the international environment, right? China used to assess that it was simply in an era of strategic opportunity. Now assessments include both this idea that it's one of opportunities and risks, right? I'd say that another change is that we've seen policy options widen for China, whether it is on the persuasion side or on the coercion side, right? So, and that's largely because Chinese economic and military power have grown. And so we've seen many more tools at play, whether it's, Chinese Coast Guard around Second Thomas Shoal, the use of economic ties, or being more creative about developing ties at subnational levels, right? So we've seen a broadening, I think, of policy tools and options. And I think maybe just a final note, I think China's initiatives have become more explicitly global. At the beginning of Xi's era, China was, I think, always alluding to the idea that it sought a fairer or more equitable world. But obviously over time, we've seen the emergence of more explicit global initiatives.
Yeah, thank you. That's really useful set of views. Jude, I wonder if I can go to you for your take.
I'm not really sure I have much to add to this after those two great set of remarks. And the beauty of going last is I can say I associate myself with those remarks without having needed to think of them. So no, I think that's all correct. Maybe just to add a few other points. I think the first, to me, striking difference from late 2012 when Xi Jinping took power to today is just how dramatic the transformation towards more unbridled dictatorship the system has become. And I don't use dictatorship in a mustache twisting way, but just diagnostically and analytically to describe the structure of the political system. I'd welcome a better word than dictatorship, but we're clear, Jake, as you write about in the report, whether it's dismantling de jure and de facto limitations on the top leader's power through term limits on the office of the presidency in 2018, new accountability systems within the CMC and the Politburo, which tie individuals more clearly to the personage of Xi Jinping, elevation of his personal authority and ideology within the system. As both Amanda and Rory have mentioned, China has always been autocratic, but a much tighter political system now, constricting civil society such as it was, rewiring the incentive structure for cadres up and down the system, sort of more tightly binding it to Leninist discipline, anti-corruption campaign, which is still rolling and evolving and will always be there because it's both, I think, functionally useful for Xi Jinping, but I think he also sees it as necessary because the system still does have, by their own political logic, far too much autonomy for actors in the system. So, I mean, all this is heading in a very, very dark direction. And before, the way you would get transitions in the system is through changes in leadership. And, we had this in 1976 with the death of Mao, and then poor Hua Guofeng as an interregnum, and then Deng Xiaoping. We had this again starting in the early 1990s, just after 1989, but throughout the 1990s as Jiang Zemin consolidated power and sort of took it in in the model of seeing a sort of softer authoritarianism as China entered the WTO, and then again under Hu Jintao. And the problem now is, especially by US presidential standards, Xi Jinping is a sprightly 71, or he will be in June. And so I think we have to expect that he's going to remain in office as long as he can, which the actuarial tables would put that certainly for another decade or so. And so just the profound change in political direction that has occurred over the last 11 and a half years, I see no endogenous force which is going to provoke a shift in trajectory that's going to sort of bring the system back from where it's heading now, which is toward, again, this more sort of unbridled dictatorship. And I think that's, you talk a lot about this in the report, Jake. And so I think the real imaginative leap that I can't quite make yet is, what does this system look like in another 8 or 10 years? And a final thought on this is, I think the worsening geopolitical environment around China, much of which is provoked by China's own behavior and concerns that are growing in the region, but nonetheless, China's perception of a increasingly fractious geopolitical environment, which is showing up, as Amanda mentioned, in their highest level assessments, like the 20th Party Congress work report. The worse the geopolitical environment becomes, the more I think it reinforces for Xi Jinping and the system that the course they're on now is correct, right? You're going to need to double down on fortifying your economy in the face of what you see as a U.S. economic containment strategy. You're going to continue to need to bolster the capabilities of your armed forces to be able to deal with this much more intense military competition in your immediate backyard. And then, it's something we haven't talked a lot about, but the dramatic buildup of a domestic national security administrative state under Xi Jinping starting in 2013, early 2014. I think it just sort of reinforces the necessity of continuing to build this fearsome national security state because of all the challenges you're dealing with, one of which is sort of a slowing economy, which creates all sorts of ripple effects in terms of perceptions of social stability. So that, I think, will probably be the big continuity moving forward, is whereas you'd like to think that failure would provoke a rethink of political trajectory, I just think that's not likely. And so it's just going to be essentially a doubling down of where we're heading now.
Yeah, thank you, Jude. I agree with that. And I think it raises a subsequent question, which is, since the 20th Party Congress back in October of 22, Xi Jinping has surrounded himself with what I use the term loyalists in the paper just to try to kind of use the plain English term. We can debate whether they're loyalists or not, but I think it kind of raises the question that you're saying about what type of advice Xi Jinping might be getting from his inner circle about the nature of the international environment, the role that China's own behavior plays in driving tensions or not, and how to respond. It seems like our base case given the people that she's surrounded himself with, is that he's probably receiving some advice that's pretty sycophantic and probably more or less being told what he wants to hear. But I think another model is theoretically possible for a group of people, figures whose overarching political agenda is the same, basically to support the Xi Jinping project. Is it possible there's more room for them to debate the best way to carry out that agenda internally, given that they're kind of all in the same boat politically? And do we have kind of good evidence either way? Jude, maybe I'd go back to you on that, but I'd be curious what Rory and Amanda think as well.
Only, Jake, because you and I talked about this literally yesterday as we recorded a podcast about your report. I mean, my first contention is I think every organizational structure is on a continuum of dictatorship in terms of information that gets to the leader. I've worked in the private sector my entire life. I think every single entity is a version of this, where leaders of organizations have to work hard to get accurate information because the incentives are to basically affirm what you think your boss wants to hear. Jim Cook, who's the CEO of the Boston Brewing Company, has a famous sort of you can call BS rule, which is he worked hard to enforce a culture where any employee who's brewing Sam Adams beer can knock on his door and say, "I think we're going in the wrong direction," but you had to offer an alternative, fix. But I say that as the exception that proves the rule, which is you have to work very hard to create an organizational culture that avoids sycophancy, or just a polite version is sort of speaking to what you think the boss wants to hear. I think we know and can imagine that if that exists in the Boston, beer company, that's going to exist by magnitudes of order greater in China's political system. And so I think, Jake, your sort of dual framing, I think both are probably true at the same time. I think Xi Jinping did not build a team starting with the 19th Party Congress and then the 20th Party Congress that said, "I want loyalists." I think what he said is, we've got a clear agenda. We know what we need to do. I need everybody on the boat who's going to row in the same direction, right? I don't need bickering and infighting. And I've been able to reach escape velocity in ways that Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin didn't, where I don't have these party elders breathing down my neck, constricting my bound of action. So I want a team that moves in the same direction. So I think that's what he thinks he's doing. The problem is, I'm sure that we have, because these are people who have in many ways owe their career to Xi Jinping, people like Tsai Chi, who have no business being that high in the party hierarchy if it was based on the normal meritocratic sort of escalator. I'm sure understand that they serve at the pleasure of Xi Jinping. And so therefore, marshaling information that carefully aligns with what you think Xi Jinping wants is probably the norm in the system. And so is he hearing heterodox views? Maybe one of the values of having someone like Li Qiang, who's very close to him, or a Tsai Chi or Ding Xuexiang, is that they have the trust to be able to sneak in bits of inconvenient information because, they have a close relationship. But I suspect it's probably more of the former, which is we have a very sort of maladapted information ecosystem that's not giving Xi Jinping sort of a full range of opinions on issues.
That's great. Rory, Amanda, either of you want to come in on this question?
Sure. I think, we don't have really good evidence of how information flows in the Chinese system right now. We can only infer from what we know our Chinese interlocutors tell us and what we can see, which is to say, again, that the political environment is very tight. And there probably is some version of a game of telephone happening as information flows up and down the system. I think, though, one aspect of this information environment that I think deserves a little bit more attention and maybe a bit of a strategic rethink is the value of Xi Jinping thought in the system. So you're Xi Jinping, you're at the head of this massive bureaucracy governing a very dynamic and complex society, and you trust almost no one in the system, but you've got to somehow signal what your priorities are and what is acceptable within the bounds of a much tighter political system where you want to retain the power to, cut off the heads of someone who sticks their neck out too much. And that, I think, is where the Xi Jinping thought comes in, it gives lower level cadres and people who are existing in concert with the system, but slightly outside it, whether you're in the private sector or business, a top level understanding of what these changed political parameters are. So I think there's been, some kind of criticism in the Western media and analysis, criticism among private sector companies that are operating in China about the amount of time it takes to study and absorb Xi Jinping thought. But to me, that is actually the key to getting your information through to top leadership is couching it in the terms that the top leadership wants to hear the most about. So I think it has an incredible value in the political system. It should not be dismissed as an ideological exercise that is unworthy of people's time and attention. It tells us what to do. It gives the roadmap for bringing those actionable insights up through the system, and therefore, an area that I think American analysts and global analysts should give a little bit more time and attention to, even as it's complex, contradictory, confusing, sometimes maddening to work yourself through all of the tenets of it.
Yeah, that's a really important point. Amanda, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, just to say that was a really great point, Rory, in terms of really learning from the Chinese as to how you package some of the messages you're trying to get through to the leadership. Listen, I don't think any of us really know what's going on at the top, right? But there are certain things we do know. So one, in terms of the information environment, there's plenty of anecdotes out there about the level of self-censorship that occurs throughout the system, including amongst Chinese scholars who sit inside government institutions, right? The objective is not to speak the truth necessarily, but to mirror what the top wants to hear. And this is out of consideration of both individual, but also bureaucratic and institutional interests, right? You want to make sure that your institution, is standing on the right side, really. But, I think there has been, following the 20th Party Congress and the end of COVID-19, I think greater dexterity and I might add rationality in the PRC's approach in its foreign policy, but that may be more reflective of Xi's more empowered position following the Party Congress rather than the composition or the kinds of conversations that are happening in the Standing Committee. I think for sure the amount of bargaining space is much more limited now, but I think that even if the committee is entirely composed, and it is composed of Xi loyalists, there will always inevitably be some degree of competition and clash of interests. And it's not just about jostling for power. I think some of it is simply because each of the men are tasked to represent different policy interests, and with it, the sort of institutional interests that come behind those sorts of policies, right? So whether it's Li Cheng in terms of economic growth or Tai Chi on the security side, right? There's a natural sort of clash in terms of what those dual policies are trying to achieve at some point, right? And so I think given that, we know that there's at least some level of division and clash of interests, even if it is within much smaller, I think, parameters under Xi.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, especially thinking about how, in a way, the bureaucracies and the people tasked with representing those bureaucracies in the elite leadership are therefore shaped in some ways by the bureaucracies, and presumably, that's maybe to Jude's example, that's something we see in the Chinese system, but also in every other system where senior leaders can kind of get captured in some ways or to some degree by the organizations they oversee. I think this also relates to another question about what has been the effect of China's domestic economic slowdown on Beijing's approach to the world. I mean, I think that this has been a pretty important, we can debate how structural this shift is, but if the old narrative was primarily about China's rapid rise and the kind of unstoppability of it, it's really put that's kind of shifted. Do we have any sense of how Xi seems to see these developments, and does he see them as challenges or as temporary? Does he see the challenges as temporary hurdles or more part of a structural slowdown? And what does that mean about what the rest of the foreign policy needs to do to support the economic situation or deal with the economic situation? So I'll just take this question. I see also some questions coming in the chat, so we'll go to the audience in just a second. But does anyone want to take on this question of how we're starting to see reflections of China's domestic economic slowdown in Beijing's foreign policy?
I can hazard a guess.
Great.
So first, I think the narrative on how the Chinese, especially the leadership, see the economic slowdown is more of a kaleidoscope than one clear narrative. Because I think on the one hand, you see Xi Jinping in speeches and high-level documents accepting part of the slowdown is inevitable. And I think a little bit like for folks old enough to have learned to drive stick shift, when you're shifting gears, the car will temporarily slow down before you can get a higher gear. And I think some amount of this is Xi Jinping saying, look, we've been operating off of an economic development agenda for a long time, which was building up systematic risks in the system. And so I am using my political capital to basically force painful changes. And so, a big puzzle initially sort of coming out of COVID is why, and even in COVID, is why isn't China stimulating more? And I think Xi Jinping was saying, first of all, I want to break the back of moral hazard for local governments. I know they're eating bitterness, but I don't care. These folks have become too comfortable with a backstop from Beijing. And so we're going to have to push through painful reforms. Second, I'm okay if Alibabas of the world get their stock price hit, because I don't want us steering, shortages of talent, technology, and capital to effete bourgeois food delivery, apps. I want this to be moving towards technologies which are going to power our economy in the future. And then finally is, how do I, Xi Jinping, get out of some of these sort of productivity and demographic traps with the magic sprinkle of technology, right? If I have fewer workers, we need to build a robotics industry and an AI industry and a digital industry that basically allows us to give what workers we do have far more productivity capacity. So that's the sort of optimistic spin of it. The pessimistic spin is how much policy dysfunction, Jake, to a point you made in the report, just how much policy dysfunction there is across the system. And so I'm sure in Xi Jinping's head, the growth slowdown is a result of, external containment plus the fact that we're shifting gears. And I think there's probably not as much introspection within the senior leadership about the way in which policy, and political mishandling is contributing to this. And if you talk to sort of Chinese economists, even in the government, on the econ side, they're far more aware of where policy mishaps are aggravating the growth slowdown. Final quick comment, because I realized your question was about foreign policy, which I just remembered. I think there's a broad logic to the fact that right now, to Amanda's point about some rationality in the system, right now at the margin, Beijing prefers a quiet external environment in areas where it feels like it has some control. I would say Second Thomas Scholl might be an outlier there potentially, in terms of, I think they would be willing to see increased friction if an opportunity arises. But in areas like how they've been handling cross-strait relations thus far since the January election, even in the bilateral relationship with the United States, I think it's clear that, again, at the margin, not fundamentally, but at the margin, they prefer some stability. I think the question is, I don't think that's permanent. And I don't think that's permanent on the upside or the downside. If the economy improves, oftentimes you see more truculence from the Chinese when they feel confident. But I also think if the growth slowdown is the new normal, we shouldn't expect that Xi Jinping is going to play it cautious for the next decade. Over.
Yeah, I think that's right. Amanda, Rory, do you want to come in on this?
Sure. Just to say really quickly, I do think that we're seeing a sort of tactical moderation taking place. That has been in place, or the CCP has tried to put it in place since the 20th Party Congress. Obviously, we had a big balloon incident derail that, so that accounts for some of the delays, I'd say, on the U.S.-China front. And this is evident in, whether it's, as Jude is saying, in cross-strait relations since the elections, to statements that have come out of the Foreign Affairs Work Conference, right? There's sort of indications of this. But I would maybe just say that I think slowing domestic growth is a factor, right? And I don't know that it's clear to me how heavily that factor is weighed in this choice to be more tactically restrained, right? Other factors include the fact that US-China competition has intensified. The Biden administration has been quite effective at pulling in allies and partners, including around denying China cutting-edge technology. So I'm not sure about, I think there's a number of factors that's causing this sort of tactical shift. And I think, going forward, what we probably want to ask ourselves is sort of, will the leadership succeed? As Jude was saying, I think according to those who watch the Chinese economy, Beijing has really chosen relatively modest efforts to stimulate the economy, which suggests some degree of confidence, right, that China can weather the storm. And so the question is whether the leadership will succeed, and will China be able to achieve sufficient technological breakthroughs. And I think another question maybe to ask is, if we assume lower levels of growth or different sources of growth that creates new winners and losers, what's the new social contract, if anything, that emerges? And then how does that affect foreign policy? I think it's maybe a little bit early for answers to those questions, but I think certainly like a China that is distracted with internal challenges is less likely to create new problems abroad, but at the same time is more sensitive perhaps to, adversaries seen as taking advantage of their weaknesses.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Rory, do you want to come in on this one?
Maybe just very briefly, I think that it can sometimes be really confusing to look at Chinese foreign policy decision-making over time because it operates on a fair amount of inertia. I still think that the Chinese Communist Party's major focus is domestic and internal, and those priorities probably trump every other consideration, including how it executes foreign policy, unless it's directly linked back to those domestic political economy inputs. For example, Belt and Road projects that create the necessary inputs for manufacturing in China to then sell to the developed Western world and accrue, finance and economic benefit back to China. It seems to me that China, that the leadership style and the foreign policy decision-making style is to kind of wait for the crises to develop out of that foreign policy inertia and then make big decisions. I think there's clearly been a big decision in the last 2 years to try to improve the relationship with the US. And that probably came out of many different moments of crises. But it seems to me that crises and events tend to drive major shifts in foreign policy. And so it's really difficult to predict, what are the domestic political economy trends that have an effect on foreign policy. It's a little momentary to that moment of crisis. I think at a moment of crisis, Xi Jinping and top leaders sit down and say, hey, what's going on? How do we kind of shape it? Then they come out with big sweeping directional changes that are then implemented by the foreign policy and policymaking bureaucracy. So I would suggest maybe taking an analytical shift in approach from linking those two things together as like a continuous line and more as a series of moments and events that shape the policy over time.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it's an important counterpoint to, the sort of canard that you often hear out here that everything in China is kind of long planned in the future. And they're always, that there is a lot more reactivity in the system than is probably frequently acknowledged. I want to turn to questions from the audience. So maybe I'll start with one from kind of combined one from Sasha. And she asks, Amanda, you mentioned the PRC has had a more rational foreign policy since the 20th Party Congress. How much does China's U.S. watching community or Western watching community influence that? Are there many watchers of the West in the system, and how influential are they?
So the answer to that is yes, there are many America watchers across China's systems. The second question is much harder to answer. Based on anecdotes, it does seem that my sense, at least in terms of a shift that I've seen in the last, let's say, 8 years, that folks who are doing the sort of equivalent analytical work that we are doing in the think tanks that service the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or other state council agencies, but probably not the Ministry of State Security. So there's differences across the board. I think institutionally, my sense is that those servicing the MFA are often engaged in a fair amount of self-censorship. I think that even if an individual scholar seeks to try to, let's say, improve his country's policies, censorship occurs at the leadership levels of institutions. Okay, so there's so many layers of censorship here that we're talking about that one feels that how could it be possible that these guys have the same level of influence as they did in years past? Now, I don't think that's necessarily the case for those who sit under the Ministry of State Security necessarily, but I think though, compared to 7 or 8 years ago, influence at the scholarly or simply below leadership level is less. There's less influence all around. And as Rory was saying in the beginning, I think we just are struggling with the ability to influence those perceptions, knowing this constricted information environment exists.
Yeah, very insightful. Rory or Jude, do you all want to come in on this question? And then we'll have one more from the audience before we wrap up. No? Okay. Oh, go ahead if you like, Rory. Okay, all right. Sorry, I wasn't sure if you were coming in. All right, so we'll take the next question from Jeremy. And he says, can you talk about decision-making as it relates to PLA unsafe and risky intercepts against U.S. allies and partners? How should we think about the guidance released by Xi Jinping and the Central Military Commission, the CMC, as well as the question of crisis management or lack thereof involving the U.S. and PRC more recently? So maybe I'll just venture a quick my view on this, and then maybe others can jump in. So my view on this is that broadly speaking, the guidance from the top has probably been for the PLA to be more operationally aggressive at the tactical level. That broadly there's been guidance to broad guidance to say be more forward-leaning in defending our interests down to the tactical level. Now, how that's actually interpreted by any given operator, any pilot, any ship captain, any water cannon operator, and so on, might be beyond what the elite leadership really had in mind, or they just don't really understand at the tactical level what's available. But also in the field, tempers flare, right? I mean, people, it's not always an objective analysis that you might have back in Beijing or in Washington. It's probably different when you're seeing aircraft come at you quite quickly, or you feel like that's the day you want to be a hotshot in the pilot's seat. And so I think my sense is that that in the broad sense it's been deemed acceptable, but especially if it begets a crisis, like the EP3 incident, the leadership will probably conclude that it maybe wasn't such a good idea, even though they sort of signed off on the broad direction. What do others think?
I mean, I think I would agree with everything you said, and just also add that I think in the U.S. strategic and policy community, we're very worried about unintended escalation of one of those incidents. And it occupies a lot of our strategic thinking and time. How do we put guardrails onto the relationship so that we can manage escalation? I don't think China sees this in the same way at all. I think they see the establishment of guardrails as kind of a seatbelt for the Americans or Western powers or allies to do more to challenge them. So I think you're right that tactically at an operational level, there's been a bit of a loosening of restraints to defend Chinese interests. That is how they would see it, not to be aggressive towards others, but to aggressively defend their interests. But I am, just like you, I think, less convinced that the Chinese political system would allow unintended escalation. And I think they see our attention to escalatory dynamics, not just in the Indo-Pacific, but around the world, as a constraint on any of those tactical changes or tactical missteps escalating into a wider war. So I think they feel kind of safe in some ways, just because of the U.S. strategic community's attention on de-escalation. And I think they also, but they would also politically constrain any crisis that would evolve. And you don't have to look too far into the recent past to see an example of this. When the Taiwan Coast Guard accidentally hit a PRC national boat and killed 2 PRC nationals, captured 2 others, there was not an immediate escalation of crisis. The political directives, I think, overwon the day, and there was a pulling back, and even in a very sensitive area with very sensitive incidents happening. So I think that is probably the pattern of behavior that we'll see in the current era until the guidance changes.
Yeah, I think that's right. Anyone else want to jump in on this last point, and then we'll wrap it up? No?
Just to say really quickly, I agree with all that, but I guess maybe a way of turning it around, as Rory was saying, the Chinese mindset on this is just fundamentally really different from the US's. In the Chinese conception of crisis management, it doesn't exclude escalation or risky maneuvers. In the sort of Chinese conception of crisis management, sometimes escalation or a greater show of military strength is needed to control and stabilize a burgeoning crisis, right? And so we've seen sort of writings on that, and we see it in the ways in which China is utilizing heightened risk, whether that's Taiwan or Second Thomas Shoal, to signal costs to an adversary or to a target government.
Yeah, I think that's right. And even when crises are de-escalated over time, there's often kind of a structural incremental price that's paid, as you said. Even I think in the Kinmen incident of recent, that's happened over this year, you've seen a more aggressive operational pattern in the vicinity of the archipelago. Even though the immediate crisis was de-escalated and was probably from the guidance to wait at least until May, until we see the incoming Lai administration, and then probably test them there in Taiwan.